Hey there, I'm Mr. Terry, a high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video. All right, today's topic is going to be on common slavery myths. And the video I wanted to check out and comment on is going to be coming from the Cynical Historian, which is actually my first time reacting to his channel, even though I've known him for a long time now. And his video is simply called 10 Common Slavery Myths. The slavery trade is something I've always very much been interested in and learning about it, not just from like the Atlantic slave trade position, but really the whole history of it and how it has been done in different places of the world at different times. And there's a good chance that there is a slavery myth that you probably believe in. So we're going to be checking out the Cynical Historian's video on this, and I'm going to be adding my stuff as always. All right, please support this original creator. He's a great friend of the community. The video link is going to be down below. Make sure you're supporting that, and make sure you're subbing to Cynical Historian. He also just wrapped up his PhD. Congrats on that, buddy. All right, let's get to it. Okay, another thing I'd like to know in the comments is, are any of these myths that are going to be talked about, are these things that you've seen in your classrooms before? Those are definitely things I'm interested in as a teacher to make sure, you know, those myths don't keep getting regurgitated. It's an old-timey video.
Hey, Cypher here. There are a lot of misconceptions surrounding the institution of slavery, especially here in the United States. These myths often serve pernicious political purposes that can be highly detrimental to a proper conception of history. So here are...
Yes, 1,000 times yes. The history of slavery has been politicized so much by every point of view that it's naturally probably hard to keep track of it and know what's true or not.
10 of those myths debunked in no particular order. Since they aren't in a particular order, each one is fairly different from the other, so you should stick around.
Oh, okay, here they are. White slaves in America. America invented slavery. I hope nobody thinks that. The first slave owner in America was black. The Union fought to end slavery. The South seceded over states' rights. Lost cause theory, right? Few Southerners owned slaves. Factory workers were like slaves. Black soldiers fought for the Confederacy. Africans were captured by Europeans. And white people ended slavery. Okay.
Because the list goes all over the place. Just as an aside, I'm going to be focusing mostly on the US because this is where the myths serve their most malignant political purpose. If you are someone who is offended by these facts, check my sources. As per usual, they are in the description.
This is where he's very much an academic in his background, again, getting PhD and stuff. And it was fun. I got to be interviewed for one of his videos and stuff like that, and he was, you know, talking to me about his, you know, PhD and what he was researching. Awesome stuff there. So, all right, okay, first one: white slaves in America. Are we talking indentured servitude or what?
It is a common meme going around the internet. Anytime a Black Lives Matter issue comes up, I'll see people putting these up on Facebook. Well, these
Pause my video if you want to see all these. I won't stop on all these memes up there.
All wrong. White slaves did exist, but not in the American colonies. Mostly on the Barbary Coast, where Muslim corsairs would capture and enslave whites. In the New World, the closest whites got to being enslaved was indentured servitude. Indentured servitude is a system in which one is forced to labor for a limited period of time. Sometimes there were cruel bosses, but there were many more laws protecting against cruel masters of indentured servants than slaves. And there was, in fact, a legal difference. Also, sometimes people were sentenced to indentured servitude for crimes they had committed. Their contracts could even be sold by owners. But generally, these contracts would only be for 5 to 20 years. Slavery, indentured servitude, was not. Some might call indentured servants sentenced to life slavery, but that would be like calling a modern prisoner sentenced to life a slave.
Yeah, especially if they'd entered into an agreement that did have a time frame on there. So one question would be, if you're asking yourself, why would somebody enter into indentured servitude? You know, one thing could be as you know, as the the Americas were becoming more populated, and the British, speaking mostly to the British 13 colonies here, it was a very lucrative thing for people to come over. But you got to understand that, like, not everybody can pause their life, like if you're in Europe, and have the money and the means to just hop on a ship over to North America and then find a piece of land. All that it'd be very, very expensive. So like the first people coming over, that especially want to invest in land, they're not poor people. So like the question would be then, what if you didn't have that startup money to move over and get land? One way to do that was to enter yourself in indentured servitude, right? So you are going to work for someone on some land, and then you contract yourself over to them. And then when that term is up, you may be able to get some land for yourself or something like that. It's kind of you're paying a debt, right? And you're working that off to eventually be a freed landowner, right? And the contracts can vary a lot depending on what you're going to get out of it, but largely again it was seen as a good investment in yourself. If you didn't have the means on your own to go and buy land, work off a debt to someone where then you can get land, and then you get your full freedom.
That's just weird. This myth tends to focus on the Irish, who did in fact suffer tremendously under English rule. Some could be said to have been put into serfdom, but that was in the old world. In the new one, the closest they came to slavery was indentured servitude, and it was generally voluntary, not coerced. Nor were they treated more brutally than black slaves.
There were also a lot of push factors for Ireland. I mean, later on, you also have things like the Irish potato famine, which was killing so many people in Ireland, and they had to flee, and they weren't going to go to Britain. America invented slavery. Okay, nobody thinks this, right?
The invention of slavery predates history itself. While it is generally incorrect to say that ancient Persian and Egyptian states practiced slavery, we know from their records that slavery existed in surrounding states. Furthermore, there is archaeological evidence that shows it was a common practice throughout the world.
Yeah. And in a lot of societies. Persia was kind of, famous for that, of not using that type of labor. Which also gives great press in places like the Bible, where Persia comes in and for the Jews, and they get kind of liberated there and that kind of thing. But yeah,
nearly every place in the world had slavery at some point in its history or prehistory. Chattel slavery, as in the practice of hereditary race-based enslavement, was something that was practiced throughout the Middle East and Asian steppe for centuries prior to 1492. In fact,
chattel slavery, by the way, is where you are seen as actual property of the slave owner. You are their property, and that is not always the case for slavery. Sometimes you're not seen as property. A lot of times, again, in history, slaves are not even enslaved for their whole lives. In some cultures, the slaves actually assimilate into the culture and basically become like family members. A lot of different versions of slavery.
Much of Islamic states practiced it until the fall of the Ottoman Empire in 1918, and some well after that. The last African country to abolish slavery was Mauritania, and it happened in 1981, and it is still a problem for many countries. Several countries, especially Mauritania, still have prominent illegal and de facto slavery. Since the government is unwilling to enforce its mandates against slavery, many people still hold slaves today. European empires, such as the Greeks and Romans, had practiced slavery and were crucial to their economies.
You mentioned earlier about the Ottoman Empire. Ottoman Empire also had a kind of interesting policy for slavery too. In Islamic law, you could have slaves, but they can't be other Muslims. And the common thing for the Ottoman Empire was, one of them most famously was Christian boys, especially from the Balkan area, Serbia, that kind of area. So they were seen as legal in the legal sense of that. But then interestingly, like some of them, like the Janissaries, were taken from there, and then they were basically slaves, but they were also like pretty much like had the Christianity kind of brainwashed out of them, and then were basically forced to become Muslims, and also incredibly devout ones because they answered directly to the Sultan. Interesting story there, but that's a kind of a policy for Islam, is not to enslave other Muslims.
The only real reason why they stopped was that the system of serfdom implemented after the Roman Empire made slavery kind of unnecessary for a while.
Serfs basically were slaves. I mean, they were bound to the land that they were to the land that they lived in. So I mean, yeah, serfs, kind of difference between a peasant and a serf. Serfs are maybe one step above slaves. First slave owner was
no black man was the first slave owner in America.
I'd heard
as
that rumor, but
memes are apt to say. The
I never
person
felt
they're
confident
referring
teaching
to was an Angolan indentured servant named Anthony Johnson, who in turn came to own indentured servant contracts after he earned his freedom. He even had the first written record of refusing to accept the end of an indentured contract, thereby making the man named John Kacer a legal slave. But there had been slaves in that colony since before the Kacer lawsuit in 1655. African slaves.
Can you see though how that thing could be politicized for people that probably really want to take more of a stance that like, or they don't like the idea of like that it was, you know, like white people are, you know, not just the sole bad guys. Kind of reminds me, I'm trying to, I don't think that came up. And I did a video covering PragerU's video about slavery, and there was a lot of like apologetics, you know, for like white Americans. And those are the type of things that you would see possibly pop up. That one though I don't remember that being in the video though with Candace Owens.
Were sold in 1634 there, and I'm not referring to indentured servants either. I mean straight up slaves. This is normally meant to show that slavery in the New World was colorblind, but that doesn't show it in the slightest.
Not so much in the New World, though.
It had been racially based since the second voyage of Columbus. Spanish colonies had been practicing chattel slavery for over a century, including in Florida. It took a while for the racism to build up in the English colonies, but it did so, regardless of who owned the slaves.
The Union fought the Civil War to end slavery. So myth saying that's what it was about or was not about. It was keeping the Union together. I mean, let's be honest.
The Civil War was not initially fought to end slavery. Abraham Lincoln was very clear in 1862 by stating, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that."
A lot of people say where it really, because like you had these opinions, and you know, with Lincoln and his like campaigning for presidency in 1860, you know, he tried to be very clear about his policies about slavery. Like he was like, hey, if I become president, I'm not gonna ban slavery. Like slavery can exist where it is. Right. He would say that thing and made multiple comments about, you know, he didn't necessarily believe that whites and blacks were, you know, equal in any kind of social sense too. And then you can see what he's saying here too, that, you know, the war, it wasn't really about that. But it does become a weapon though of his. And the big thing that you would look at for that, the evidence of that would be the Emancipation Proclamation. And one of the effects of the Emancipation Proclamation, you know, when we look at it historically, is it's like that is really where slavery kind of makes its way up the chart, or makes its way up the list of reasons for, you know, the Civil War. And a lot of people say that's when you knew that that's what really this war was about.
The Emancipation Proclamation was not an easy decision
Sorry,
on
I didn't
his
mean to
part,
talk over him.
for there were slave states fighting for the Union. But it was prompted by people like John C. Fremont declaring slaves emancipated under their own authority as military governors.
Yeah, did you know that you know, not all slave states, especially it's interesting because it is very much like where the border ends up being of the Confederacy and the Union, is those border states. Yeah, they hadn't seceded. And interesting thing about that is the Emancipation Proclamation didn't go into effect into states that were still part of the Union. It was only supposed to affect states in the Confederacy. And that's also where people are like, Lincoln isn't all in about slavery, because if he was worried about slavery, he would have, you know, freed all the slaves. Well, let's remember too, it's not like the Emancipation Proclamation was presented to the southern states and they're like, oh, our slaves are free. They didn't feel they were, you know, part of the U.S. anymore. They didn't care. He still, I mean, And how we know it didn't really matter is he still fought the war.
It also gave a crucial purpose to the Union's fight, as people were becoming more and more disillusioned of the Civil War. Instead, the North fought to keep the Union intact. Ending secession was their chief motivation. Of course, the reason for secession in the first place is a bit different.
All right, the South ceded over states' rights.
Oh boy, is this a
You've all
thorny
heard
issue.
this.
I've done an entire episode on the causes of the Civil War, but it is absolutely undeniable that slavery was a chief motivation for secession.
Check
In
out
every
Akin
document
videos, of
proclaiming
course.
secession, slavery is explicitly mentioned.
A lot of slavery in there, huh?
This is part of lost cause revisionism.
Ooh, Birth
They
of a
try to say
Nation.
that slavery was a minor factor. And
Famous, now controversial film. One of the earliest popular films, and that blew people away to see this. It was what Woodrow Wilson said. He said this movie was, what was the quote? It's like writing history with lightning. Now it's a pro KKK video. They're like the heroes of it, and there's a lot of reasons. That's one of the main things that a lot of the Wilson critics, of course, like to bring up. But
the North had been trampling over the rights of the South as independent states. They bring up the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, which states
I think they
that
watched
any
it at the White
power
House, too.
expressed by the Constitution would instead be given to the states
People love
rather
to use
than the
10th
federal
Amendment for
government. They call out that there
everything
was a tremendous difference in culture and that tariffs were choking farmers. These were all factors for sure, but not the most important one. Lincoln being elected was, and the South's fear of his position on slavery made them secede.
that election's so interesting because you actually had a viable third candidate, and you have four candidates there. But like with with Bell there, if the different political groups outside of Lincoln himself had come together, they would have won the vote. But the Southern Democrats split themselves because the Democratic Party was becoming very diverse because they were like pro-slavery, anti-slavery. Their platform was massive. So they split up on those issues, which ended up giving Lincoln, the win.
And the South's fear of his position on slavery made them secede. Everything else is peripheral to this one problem.
Lincoln didn't have
if
the
you want more on that, go watch the
over
episode
50%.
that I mentioned before.
He didn't have the majority of votes. Technically. All right, few Southerners
In
owned
1860, the time of the last census before the Civil War, roughly 36% of freemen in the South owned slaves. That would seem insignificant since they were in the minority overall.
But
as
a
one
lot of them have a
article
lot of
pointed out,
slaves.
that is roughly
Some.
the same percentage of Americans with college degrees right now. It is not an insignificant number. Furthermore, the Southern social system was entirely dependent on their peculiar institution. So even if they were not slave owners, most were heavily entrenched in a way of life that was absolutely dependent on slavery.
Yeah, it's not like it was this quiet thing behind the curtain. So even if it was, if you considered 30% to be a low number, it does the impact of slavery on the South itself is way bigger than 30%. It's like he's saying here, it's everything. I mean, and the South truly believed that their entire economy would completely collapse, and probably would have. It would have taken a lot of transition out of that. Industrial Revolution will help with that eventually. Factory workers were akin to slaves. Well, they weren't personal property.
I've heard this from actual graduate students. Hell, Karl Marx made a similar argument in Das Kapital. It's that tired Marxist terminology of wage slavery.
We haven't been paid in 2 weeks and we want our wages.
Wages? You want to be wage slaves? Answer me that. No. No, of course not. But what
Wage
makes
slavery
wage
was
slaves?
fair
Wages.
argument.
I want you to be free.
But this is a false equivocation. As I pointed out in class back then, when one possesses different legal rights, it is impossible to say those same people are equal. Slaves had far less legal rights than white factory workers. In some states, they had no rights.
Especially later on in the Industrial Revolution.
Whatsoever. If a factory owner whipped their workers, they could be sued or even jailed for assault. As a side
Again,
myth
especially
busting,
later on.
Americans were far more likely to sue each other prior to World War I than ever since. Lawsuits were extraordinarily common in comparison to today, and that myth needs to go away because it is perpetrated by big businesses and benefits them only. Anyways, there were many business practices, such as chaining workers to their factory position, that were decidedly cruel, but that is nothing compared to what many slaves experienced. Now, it is also a myth that all slave owners were cruel and abusive.
Right.
For many, slavery was not as unpleasant as movies like to make it out to be. After all, one had to keep slaves controlled, and love is often a far more potent force of coercion than fear. The various acts of rebellion that were prevalent throughout the history of slavery had to be curtailed somehow, and many masters were kind to their slaves. But the peculiar institution had a corrosive effect on anyone involved.
But it's like kindness to what purpose? Kindness to have a relationship with those slaves, kindness to keep them from revolting, or like true kindness and love for the person. You know what I mean? Because he's saying, you know, that kindness can be or love can be a good way to keep them in control. You wonder what if people that were, or slave owners that were doing that, to what purpose were they doing it? All right, slave soldiers fought for the Confederacy.
It is true that there were slaves who were forced to work for the Confederacy.
One thing that was legal back then is you could get somebody to replace you. You got conscripted. You could have somebody could fight in your stead, and that could bring up this situation right here.
There is no record of slaves voluntarily working for the
Right.
Confederacy, save for one particular instance. Towards the end of the Civil War, the Confederate Congress passed a bill that allowed for a slave regiment to be created. It was supposedly voluntary, but then again, so was their Conscription Act. And conscription, by no stretch of the definition,
volunteers.
can be defined as voluntary.
Yeah, if you're rich, you're going to be able to get out of the war.
In either case, the regiment that was created never saw action, and was a divisive issue for the Confederates in general.
Yeah, I mean, they're not going to want to fight with them, too. Africans were captured by Europeans. Some were, yes, but majority were not.
The Colombian slave trade was created by Europeans, and the place that they received slaves was in West Africa. But unlike what is commonly conceived, they did not just go raiding inland with nets to grab up unsuspecting tribesmen. The African slave trade was predicated on Africans selling other Africans.
Yeah. Now, at the beginning in the early part of the slave trade, if you want to go as far back as like 1400s, where Portugal was the first to really kind of start doing this for Europeans in this era. That was happening at first, but then obviously, like for Portugal, was not this massive inland power. They didn't have the means to go and have high success rates of going into an African nation, and these were mighty nations and actually enslaving people. But yeah, found out far more profitable actually and efficient to buy the slaves from African slave or African, kingdoms that, could do that on their own part. They could get captives and then sell them. So
it was a system already in place before Columbus arrived to take the first slaves to the New World in 1498. Like most slave institutions, it was created by capturing prisoners during warfare. Europeans had no need to kidnap Africans, like they show in movies all the time. Africans were already doing that for them. They developed...
The Africans have been enslaving each other before that, long before that. In fact, the Islamic trade, the Indian Ocean, there was a slave trade in the Indian Ocean where, Islamic slave traders were doing this. What the Europeans did largely is entered into an already existing system. And not just because of the Islamic slave trade, because they're going in West Africa, where a lot of that Indian Ocean slave trade network was happening in East Africa, but Africans also enslaved other Africans in West Africa before this.
Developed an entire economy around that trade. This devastated Western Africa, which has yet to recover from the economic circumstances imposed by the transatlantic slave trade. Doesn't vindicate Europeans for their slave trading, of course.
You know, one of the effects, interestingly, is because slave traders were more interested in men, like men as slaves. I think like 2/3, I forget the exact number, about were men. That actually really screwed up the gender ratios in Africa, where, you know, there were more women than men, and that affected like marriages as well. So you could marry, you know, because there's more, you know, women than men, you know, men could, you know, have more wives if you didn't get enslaved.
Wrongs don't make a right, let alone how Europeans would encourage the trade through their economic incentives and political maneuvering in Africa. It was a lucrative business after all. It just means that Africans were active participants in the trade and not only victims of it.
It's both. White people ended slavery. This is one of the interesting ones. This was one of the arguments that came up in that PragerU video with Candace Owens. They were saying, you know, again, it was apologetics. They're like, yeah, the British had this empire and had all these slaves and stuff, but they were also like the first of the European powers to ban it. Like that cancels it out.
Well, slavery is still an ongoing issue. Many countries throughout the world have clear slavery, and not just coerced labor like Chinese factory workers. I mean, chattel slavery still exists.
We weren't allowed to be reporting on slavery. It's a practice the government tries to hide from outsiders. But as we would find, slavery is everywhere in Mauritania, if you know where to look.
It is illegal worldwide, but practiced anyways in a number of countries, so slavery has not ended. Furthermore, abolishment of slavery was not an invention of white people.
Not an invention
the Qin dynasty
at all.
were the first recorded abolitionists. They are the reason why we call that country China.
China, 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 China now.
And the first Chinese emperor was an abolitionist. Slavery fluctuated.
And that dude was brutal. Qin Shi Huangdi, absolutely brutal. But yeah, abolished it. That's amazing.
Throughout world history. The idea that slavery is inherently wrong does not originate in Europe, nor is it particularly unique there.
Right.
Abolition was also motivated by slave revolts. Slaves were not just docile servants, but often actively opposed their own enslavement. Slave revolts happened throughout the modern period, one of which culminated in the liberation of Haiti, long before most European countries abolished slavery.
Yeah.
Even when they were forced into the most
1800s.
wretched conditions possible aboard ship on the Middle Passage, there were around 250 shipboard slave revolts. It was such a problem that slave ships often had barricades to defend themselves against such revolts. There's also a kind of disgusting side to claiming that whites freed the slaves. For how wonderful it is that the captors freed the captives. How nice of them to just decide on their own volition to stop oppressing people.
Let's also remember that some of the times, or the instances where slavery was abolished, was also a time where slaves were becoming less important as well, especially as the Industrial Revolution was growing.
This is a particularly pernicious myth because it makes slaves objects rather than actors in their own right, as well as completely forgetting the Western powers were particularly egregious when it came to the abolition of slavery. All of these myths need to be stopped.
All right, final thoughts, and I want your thoughts. Okay, great video. I think these types of videos where you address common misconceptions are probably among the most important video content and content that can come out about history, because there are so many of them. And if you're somebody that's watching videos like this, I already know, just based on if you're actually using your YouTube time to watch videos like this, that, you know, you probably believe that too. And I think the slavery one is a great one to look at for this. So I did ask you all at the beginning of the video, or if any of these myths were things you vividly remember being taught. Not just saying, just kind of you've heard of it, but like actively remember it being taught. Interested to know what you're hearing in your schools, right? So of course, as a teacher, you know, my job is always to try to know, you know, what is most likely true and most likely untrue. So I think us as educators, it's very, very important for us to do that. Even if there's backlash, you know, which can happen as a history teacher. You're teaching things that, again, might be a common misconception. And because of that, people may view that, you know, like, we're lying or something like that. So we're all a part of this, though. As learners, as teachers, we're all a part and need to be a part of, you know, breaking apart myths. Anyway, so this was fantastic. Great job by Cypher over with Cynical Historian. This is one of his more popular videos. But again, very good, very academic content coming from him as someone coming through academia. And if you like that, I hope you do, the scholarly backing, then make sure you're subbing over there. I know you won't regret it. All right, with that, thanks again for hanging out. We'll see you later. Bye.